Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is human transformation, and we're going to be asking the key question: is humanity really capable of transforming this planet, our civilization, into a more joyful society, capable of supporting greater self-actualization? Given that the history of our civilization has been marked by continual war, pollution, and human oppression, there are some who doubt that transformation is possible. With me in the studio today is an optimist, George Leonard, the author of numerous books, including Education in Ecstacy, The Ultimate Athlete, The Silent Pulse, and The Transformation. George is the former vice president of the Esalen Institute and a former senior editor of Look magazine, also an Aikido instructor. Welcome, George.
Great to be here, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You know, people do make this argument that the more things change, the more they stay the same. That if you look throughout civilization, we've always had armies, we've always had warfare, we've always had oppressed people. You, I think, suggest that we should take a deeper, a broader vision and look beyond recorded history. And in that view of things, one can see that human beings have made fundamental changes.
Exactly. People always say the man was born a builder, he'll keep on building until the whole country is paved over and every river runs in concrete channels. Man was born a fighter, he will have war and conflict and cynicism for all of time. And look at history and you'll see that's very true. But as you suggest, we have to look beyond history. Let's open our canvas a little bit. Let's look at a longer wave. And certainly what we call civilization, the beginning of the nation state, didn't go back any further than 7,000 years ago, probably not that long.
Mm-hmm.
And
whereas human beings have been around maybe a million.
Hominids, certainly Homo sapiens, have been around probably a million years. It keeps getting longer and longer, you know, with every new discovery, archaeological find, it gets longer. But 5,000 years is a wink in time. Human nature evolved biologically. Our endocrine system, our nervous system, our skeletal system, musculature, everything developed when human beings were living for about 1 million years as hunters and gatherers. And as far as we can tell from the archaeological record and from the surviving primitive hunting and gathering tribes and bands, in these bands there was no permanent leadership. There was no war as we know it. There were no standing armies, no territorial war certainly. There was no bureaucracy, no lawyers. We got plenty of lawyers now. There were no lawyers when human beings evolved. Lawyers were something that was layered on after biological evolution took place. The human animal was not really made, not created biologically for what we call civilization.
Well, wasn't it in the 18th or 19th century Rousseau came up with this image we call the noble savage?
Yeah, I'm kind of sorry he did, because he overdid it so much that now you say the noble savage and this becomes a symbol of naivete. That anyone who thinks of the savage as noble is naive, and that's probably true. Things are always complicated. We should not romanticize the primitive peoples, but in any case we can see that they really lived in what we would call a different human condition and manifested a different human nature. I'll put quotes around that.
So in a sense what you seem to be saying when people talk about let's get back to good old-fashioned values, you might say yes, shamanism.
Yeah, shamanism. That was the part-time shaman was the first specialist known. There was no specialization in the hunting and gathering tribe. So many things that we consider an absolute part of human life and human nature didn't even exist. And then a transformation did occur. Now, you know, evolution, we got to get straight about this. Our good, tough scientist will say we're being a little careless about it, but evolution doesn't mean necessarily progress. It goes in both directions.
Yes.
Nevertheless, we have seen over these millennia increasing complexity evolve. We've seen the emergence of conditions, we're talking about social organization now, which probably could not have been predicted from what came before. And the first great transformation I'm speaking of in this time scale was a transformation between the hunting and gathering band and the tribal farmer. That was what we might call the agricultural revolution, when people began planting in the spring and harvesting in the fall. Now you see,
A great deal of social organization was necessary for
to
that.
bridge that gap, as Professor Skinner would say, that was the beginning of delayed reinforcement. That was kind of a harsh thing for the human being to take, because previously in hunting and gathering bands, individuals had lived in constant equilibrium and harmony with nature.
In other words,
They were part of nature.
you got to eat your food the day you killed it.
That's right. And incidentally, in hunting and gathering bands, as far as we know, they split it with geometric precision. There was no selfishness. Everything was divided up with precision. And in fact, the hunter would be the one who made the kill was the last to eat. So the tribal farmer was a bit different. To bridge the gap between planting and harvesting, religious rites, perhaps was the birth of really serious religion as being apart from the rest of
The
life.
great religions of ancient Egypt and Babylonia.
Well, that's a little
Sumeria.
later. That's a little later.
They
That's the
emerged
beginning
in
of
these-
civilization.
Ah, okay.
The tribal farmer would be more like the Zuni Indians,
Okay.
the Pueblos. The Zuni Indians spent up to 50% of their waking hours in specifically religious ceremonies, and not just the hunters and gatherers had religious ceremonies, but they were part of life.
Everybody was a shaman, so to speak.
That's right.
A shaman being a person who interacted with spirits, who was in touch with the psychological world of nature, the world of dreams.
Right. The dreamers of the Aborigines in Australia that lived a different life, but it was all integrated.
It was their natural condition
Right.
of humanity, one might say.
Exactly. The tribal farmer, they split religion apart from the rest of life. It became specific and separate. Okay, leadership was by charisma more than by heredity, and the society was organized around these like fraternities, age grade societies of men or of women. Now, strangely enough, or interesting enough, the tribal farmer type of society was often matriarchal and matrilineal. The line went down from the woman rather than the man. Okay, then we had this huge event, which is the birth of civilization, in which a lot of people think was the only way it ever was. It generally, according to the best way that we can figure it, when a surplus, an agricultural surplus developed, and more specifically, a surplus of cereal crops, the grains of the Middle East, the rice of the Far East, or 1,800 years later, the maize of Mesoamerica. You got a surplus of crops that you could store. What do you do with this surplus? You got a problem now. Can a surplus
Now
be a
you
problem?
really need social organization.
Now you need heavy-duty social organization. And wherever and whenever in the world the surplus arrived, you found the following developments. The development of huge and impressive ceremonial centers, great temples, great pyramids, and so forth, the earliest WPA
I
projects.
suppose they needed language and counting. And,
Well, you know, writing, the first scribes first writing was used to keep records in the granaries where the grain was.
Sure.
You had lawyers, marketplaces, the beginning of abstract money. You had slavery, territorial armies, territorial war, standing armies, and all of these developments which we consider part of life,
and
part
which
of
we
human
still
nature,
have today.
which we still have in a different form.
Yeah.
Caste and classes. How do you deal with the surplus? You create a very small upper class that really has access to all of the surplus and still meter out, parcel out in a rather scarcity model the rest of it to the other caste and the other classes. That's the development of caste and classes really came because of a surplus of cereal crops. And I would like to say that the development of the human being as a component of a social machine that is specialized. A component of a machine has to be standardized, specialized, reliable, and predictable. And this did a tremendous hardship on the human individual. We are still that. Now, I think we're beginning to emerge from that. But
And at this point, with the great civilizations, pretty much the tribal, the shamanistic ethic of being connected and integral and part of nature, of sharing things equally, broke down somehow.
absolutely. In fact, one of the real hallmarks of civilization is to be able to demonstrate your separateness from nature. On one of Caesar's main campaigns, he had to build a bridge, and his troops said, no, we can't cut down these trees to build a bridge because they're sacred. They have spirits in it. Caesar himself took his axe and cut down the first tree. The others followed, they built the bridge, and we've been doing that ever since. Today we have bulldozers go to the top of beautiful hills in Marin County, level them out, put that dirt down to fill up the bay, and we never stop to think what we're doing to nature. Now, for a hunter-gatherer to do such a thing couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It would be like ripping his mother.
Well, Freud wrote a book, Civilization and Its Discontents,
Yes.
in which he points out that in order to have a stable civilization, it's necessary to repress aspects of the human mind, and thus
Right.
was born the unconscious mind. And in
Right.
Freudian theory, are there fundamental ways in which we can change that situation? Maybe our human nature isn't the way we've lived for the last 5,000 years, but what are the limits to which we can kind of get back to our true nature?
Well, you see, we're talking about pretty big things
Yeah.
when we're talking about this. I would say that the Freudian neurosis structure, I wouldn't totally agree with it, but certainly with the beginning of the nation states came the beginning of neurosis. That is, dis-ease, a constant dis-ease, separating ourselves from the present moment, separating ourselves from nature, feeling constantly uneasy within our own skins. And the only remedy for this is hard work. Going out and killing a few hundred Indians, you know. The only good Indian's a dead Indian, that kind of thing. Okay, can we change? Can human beings change? Now you introduced me as an optimist. I'd rather be a possibilist. I will say that it is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that we would like to, I would like to say that we must. The basic organizing principles of civilization with a capital C, which emerged in the Pyramid Age, first of all, was a constant growth in the consumption and production of energy. Mm-hmm. If you had to draw one curve which would be paradigmatic of civilized life, it would be this exponential curve. It goes up, up, up.
And it would apply to many things, not just
many
energy,
things.
Communication, transportation.
And the other thing was a push-back mode of human relations.
Mm-hmm.
You push me, I push you back.
Mm-hmm.
Conflict is inevitable, it's necessary, it's a part of life. Not necessarily. Now, can we make the transition? My question is, must we not make the transition?
Yeah. Can we afford not to at this
Can we
point?
afford
And I
not
suppose
to?
the fact that we're here speaking about it, and we're not the only ones, indicates
That's
that
right.
our civilization, our society is self-aware enough to realize that the time is coming when we'll either change or possibly face catastrophes beyond which we couldn't recover.
That's right. Or I've often thought in my book, The Transformation, which was published in 1972, it was one of the first books that brought forward this thesis that we must change. We could have a catastrophe which would wake us up to the necessity of change. Now, in the book I said, perhaps when we have the first 10,000 people die because of some kind of toxic waste or pollution or air pollution, that the masters of our present civilization will simply say that science can work up better toxic control methods.
Mm-hmm.
It'll probably take a death of about 100,000. This is a very,
I should
you call me
imagine there have already
optimistic.
been
This is-
10,000.
That's right. This is very pessimistic.
Yeah.
That Chernobyl, there'll have to be a disaster which will kill maybe a million people. And then maybe we'll wake up to the fact that whereas the mode of organization, which was to keep developing the material world and the production and consumption of energy in an exponential way, it simply reaches certain limits. Dr. Jonas Salk wrote a book called The Survival of the Wisest. It was a very small book. It came out in 1973, 1 year after the transformation. From an entirely different point of view, biological, he came up with exactly the same conclusions as my book, The Transformation. In fact, we shared a podium one time. And he points out that every time in nature you see an exponential curve, like the growth of a population of fruit flies or bees or any form of life, of wolves or whatever, whenever you see this, watch out. It's either going to curve off and moderate or crash out.
Mm-hmm.
Now the real question
You
is,
just can't sustain exponential growth.
the biosphere, we're running up, in other words, the civilized life system is running, the social system is running up against a larger constraint, which is the carrying capacity of the biosphere.
We're running out of room to grow and
That's
expand.
right. Another basic organizing principle of civilized life, the nation state, is constant expansion, whether through colonization, through conquest of people nearby. But you see, Jeffrey, we are running out of people to conquer.
Are we capable of
That's
making
right.
the necessary adjustments?
Certainly biologically we are. The human brain, body, mind, spirit system has such tremendous potential. We are mostly unused potential, and there's nobody that can deny that. Some people have posited that the brain itself is improperly organized. I don't think that's true. The brain is mostly unused potential. Human beings, both the glory and the damnation of the human individual is its tremendous plasticity.
You know, there's a sense in Shakespearean tragedy, some of the greatest literature on the planet, that when confronted with an ultimately tragic situation, even a hopeless situation, the nobility of man is brought out, that we reach inside of ourselves and come up with the very best that's within us. And perhaps if we're faced with a potentially tragic situation today, we can rise to that challenge. Maybe we'll fail, but maybe we will really find within us what it takes.
Right. And so many times, you know, we are conflict-oriented. I think a lot of people kind of hope that UFOs will sort of come down on us. If we could really prove the existence of UFOs, then there would be something that could be...
We could rally against the invaders from Mars.
That's right. And, you know, there is a possibility that the U.S. and the USSR could become allies. That is not out of the question. It's a lot less out of the question than it was in World War II to think that we'd be allies with Japan and Germany. I mean, it was insane. Anybody who had said that in World War II would have been taken away, certifiably mad. So these things are possible. Human nature can change. We are already seeing, I think the 60s, with all of their insanity and short-sightedness and excesses and everything else, was a kind of a pitiful and glorious attempt to make some kind of transformation. I mean, take the hippie movement, which was a rejection of materialism. It was done by a lot of young people. That's one very important thing about transformation. We need people of all age groups. Just old people can't do it, just kids can't do it. You've got to get the wisdom of age and the conservatism of age with the dash and impetus and so forth of youth.
Well, I think a lot of people are pessimistic today because they got excited during the 60s and then they felt, gee, you know, nothing's happened. In fact, we've gone backwards. The country has become right-wing oriented. Social change is not a possibility. We might as well just accept our fate and try and accumulate as much as we can for ourselves in the meanwhile. But I gather that you feel we can't look at the 60s that way, or this ensuing decades.
At first, it's not true. Now, politically and education, we've retrogressed since the 60s, and perhaps in some other things. But if you would take the race situation in 1960, a fourth of the nation lived in apartheid. People of another race could not even drink water without perhaps losing their life. Everything was segregated. Look at what's going on now. I mean, it's not perfect, there's some bad situations, but who would have thought of a black mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, or Miss Mississippi in the Miss USA contest being a black woman?
So we can say we've made gains in civil rights.
We've made fantastic gains. There was no, as late as 1967, there was no women's movement. There were no rape crisis centers. There was no equal opportunity employment. There was no affirmative action, whatever. There were no battered wives centers. There was really no women's movement to speak of. It really began about 1969. Now, yes, we didn't get the ERA. We have a long way to go. But we are infinitely advanced from where we were in that glorious summer of love in 1967 that was supposed to be so revolutionary. Ecology, the word didn't exist. In 1967, that word didn't exist. The environmental movement...
we didn't have any ecological extremists back then.
It was a conservation movement, and they were just trying to conserve natural areas. They were not
Isaac Walton clubs.
Right, Isaac Walton Club. And the Sierra Club's membership in 1960 was 16,000. It's now 408,000. In almost every aspect of our life, we have progressed far beyond the 60s, and we're still dissatisfied. When the commonplace becomes, when the extraordinary becomes realized, it becomes commonplace.
And that's perhaps what's happened for us. We take these things for granted today.
We take things for granted and we say, oh, but this is not very good. What you've got to do is at least celebrate and at least acknowledge the gains that we've made since 1960.
At that time, people struggled and worked very hard and made a lot of noise to create certain change. Today, it seems as if the people who are involved in transformation are very often quietly going about their business.
The radical and religious right, they're the ones who are making all the noise. They're the flamboyant ones today. And it's just as well to keep it that way for a while, because there's a tremendous amount of, look at the anti-war movement. It's become pro-peace. Look at the citizens' diplomacy movement, which was pioneered by Esalen. You know, now you don't have to march, you just buy a ticket to Moscow. You can do your own diplomacy. Some marvelous things are happening that are not being heralded, and I would really like to see those put up in front of us as a banner, at least, so we can have some courage to go ahead in the future, because the 90s are going to be a very important decade indeed.
What do you think will be the leading edge of transformation in the coming decade?
Well, I think, first of all, the environmental movement will be and the ecology movement, first the environmental movement, which will really, the whole way we live, can we coexist with this planet? That is sort of the stick, the carrot's the other side of it. The human potential movement, now let's not call it a movement anymore, but let's just say the development, the full development of human resources. It is tremendously underdeveloped. We are running out of material resources to develop. It's getting more and more pollution, toxic waste associated with the development of physical resources. Human resources are undeveloped, almost infinite. We could start a program on the development of the human potential that would create adventures that would make the winning of the West seem pale indeed.
You know, my sense is honestly that we have no idea what the real limit of the human being is, that if we truly were to experience our full nature, it would be something that would be very surprising to us.
It would scare the hell out of us. I think that's one reason homeostasis, naturally, a society might fly apart if all the human beings started really manifesting all their human potential. And so therefore there has to be a certain conservative element there. But we can certainly manifest a lot more than we are now. So I would say that that is a great development. Also, we are going to be in the United States certainly beset with a new kind of equal opportunity challenge. Not as much with blacks as with Hispanics, from the Asian people, Pacific Rim people, and we're going to have to see what equal opportunity really means. If you look at the polls now, the polls are really what you would call in old terms very, very liberal. Have you seen the recent Time poll or the Harris poll? First of all, they show over 90% of people want more money spent by the federal government on environmental controls, environmental things like that. Most people are still in favor of abortion. In other words, just to take some of the famous liberal issues. College students, there was a huge poll that had polled 6 million college freshmen. It does it about every 4 to 6 years. And it turned out this last one, which was last year, showed that our college freshmen, even though they profess to be conservative, and even though they are indeed more interested in money than the people of the 60s, on all the other social issues, they are as liberal, if not more liberal, than the students of the 60s. So I think we're going to see something quite interesting in the 1990s.
What are the forces that have held back transformation? Why is there this intransigence at a time of need? Why didn't things move even faster when they seemed like they were about to?
Every self-regulating system, whether it's a tadpole, a frog, an individual, a family, or a nation, has a built-in homeostasis. Any change is threatening, and that's true, you know. If your blood temperature changed by 10%, you'd be in big trouble. If your blood salinity changed 10%, you'd be in big trouble. So whenever any self-regulating system, let's say now a nation, a society, recognizes this can be done subconsciously, and kind of a national subconscious, any real essential change, it will resist that change and fight against it, whether the change is for what we call the good or for the bad.
In other words, even if a change is absolutely essential, there will be a force of homeostasis working against that change.
How many people, I do this with my lecture audiences, I said, how many of you have made a New Year's resolution or some other kind of resolution? It's a good resolution, it's something that will make you feel better, and in fact you do it, you do feel better, and then you backslide. Everybody holds their hands up. Why? Okay, it's a natural tendency of every self-regulating organism to remain in the same state. You have to work in increments. So, Jeffrey, you can say this. If an idea comes along and after a while it's resisted severely, it can be for 2 reasons. One is because it's a lousy idea, and another is because it's a damn good idea. In other words, a really good idea will create the most resistance. So some of the ideas of the 60s really scared people tremendously. What they said was, this will make real changes in how we are. First of all, as a man versus being a woman. The kind of, you know, before the 60s, there was a tremendous separation.
Men were men and women were women.
Yeah. When we see the two coming together and women doing what men are doing and vice versa, and you can hardly tell the difference on the street, this is a very frightening idea, and that's probably a pretty good idea to meet the challenges of the future. The integration of life, the joining of all life, rather than the separation and splitting off of life into separate contingents.
And yet, even when change is truly joyful,
that's very threatening. I mean, how many times have you gone through 4 really joyful days, and near the end of it, you got to think, what's going wrong? The lightning's going to strike me. You know, the plane's going to crash. Again, that's homeostasis. And we've got to learn how to deal with homeostasis on an individual basis and on a national level. You got to negotiate with change. You got to be aware that even good changes will be resisted. You got to have support systems for it. You got to have standard good practices to hold you while you're making the change. You can't go running off like the hippies did. They had no support system. No wonder they crashed. The hippies also said, man, just change your head and everything will be all right. They changed their head. You got to change their whole body. You got to change your support system and your society. How do you make money? You've got to work on all of those things. Then you can make change.
Well, the people who were in their early 20s back in the 1960s are now moving into their 40s.
Yeah,
So,
midlife crisis, right? When they reevaluate things. You know, the 30s and the early 40s are a time of accumulation, materialism, nesting, getting everything together. Now they're getting this reflective period. Okay, we've got this Porsche, we've got this BMW, but I don't feel so good. You know, maybe it wasn't worth it. Let's reevaluate. The 90s are going to be a time when that huge baby boom cohort begins reevaluating the purpose of life. It's going to be a very thoughtful time. I don't think it's going to be a flamboyant time because, first of all, the 60s were a time of tremendous financial affluence. In other words, we had enough extra money to make mistakes. We're not going to in the 90s. It's going to be very spare, very disciplined, have more of a Zen quality to it. It's going to be less noisy, but I think it's going to be a very significant time of transformation and change.
it's as if this new generation is beginning to absorb the lessons. I say a new generation, a generation that is really now coming into power, coming into a position where effective change can be made.
That's right. I think we will take another look at this tremendous materialism. And we'll say, hey, wasn't that ridiculous? That doesn't money, I mean, let's go the old truism. Money does not buy happiness. And I guess they had to find out. BMWs do not buy happiness. So.
Well, it's very interesting to be able to reflect with you, George, over this period of time. And I think there are many of us amongst our viewers, and hopefully younger people who are watching too, who can get this sense of people who have been involved in transformation for decades, as you have been, that there's a time for enthusiastic, impulsive efforts towards change, and a time to reflect on that, still keeping that intention towards transformation alive.
Right. No, I really feel that there is no greater human enterprise.
George Leonard, thank you very much for being with me. It's been a real pleasure.
As usual, with you too.
And thank you for being with us.